Welcome everyone to session 1C on statistical methods. I'm Tom Donnelly. I'm the chair as well as the first presenter. And so my background, I've been actually associated with this conference. The predecessor to this was actually the Army Conference on Applied Statistics, which the predecessor to that was the Army Conference on Design of Experiments that started in 1953. So that's kind of been going. It's just in case you didn't know, before the sort of 7 years we call DataWorks, there's kind of a history to it. And the original presenters were going to be the authors, but for various reasons they couldn't make it. And I thought that this topic was important enough. I said, I really think we should have it. They said, okay, well then you can give it. And so I also have in the room with me Elizabeth Clausen, although hopefully she won't have to present, but if someone asks me something statistically deep enough that I can't field that she can, maybe we will have that conversation. The good news for you is there is a link to the recording by the original authors. And they've written a 29-page paper that they're submitting to the Journal on Computational Statistics, but is currently available on archive. And they have a lot of simulation studies in that as well. So there's a lot of material that you can go to. And if you're really, really interested in seeing this sooner, I have the video on my laptop and you can corner me. And I have the transcript to the audio. So short of me just hitting the play button and letting you listen, I'll have all of that. So one of the comments by Chris Gottwald in the talk, so I made this slide, this was not theirs, is that we are surprised that the need for identifying extrapolation isn't better appreciated by the data science community. And I have felt this way a long time. And so I've now inserted 4 of my own slides into their talk. And so you'll recognize the background here is old Army RDECom. Nowadays, this is DevCom. But I worked for the Army at the Edgewood Chemical Biological Center. And one of the projects I got asked to help analyze was a project called Agent Fate, where they looked at studying the evaporation rates of chemical agents in wind tunnels. Now, these wind tunnels actually fit inside fume hoods. Okay, so if you put something like VX or sarin there, you really don't want that blowing around. And so, you know, I came into the program, they had been doing a nice designed experiment. And when they did the analysis with an empirical quadratic response surface model, we noticed that the extrapolation values, particularly for evaporation rate, went down as the wind speed went up, which made no physical sense. So right off the bat, there's an example of extrapolation just not working. Turns out, we started to look at the physics and science behind things and came up with, well, if it's really an Arrhenius relationship, instead of, you know, Celsius, we should be using inverse Kelvin for the temperature. You know, and if it's, we shouldn't be using the volume of the drop. If it's evaporation rate, we should be using something related to the area. So by doing transformations, we essentially linearized things, and we ended up with a model that extrapolated very well. So again, this isn't a machine learning problem. This is a good old DOE problem from 18 years ago. But notice in the slides, you'll notice the sort of the blue grid response surface. There's a red rectangle. The red rectangle is where we cut through the convex hull. The convex hull is, think of it as sort of the shrink-wrapped volume of the data. So here's maybe a better way to visualize that. If I take the 11 points that aren't on the corners of the 3-dimensional designed experiment, and I connect to all those red lines, that's sort of the shrink-wrapped volume. Okay, so in this next slide here, you can see a red triangle. Well, that matches up to the front left face of this cube. That's where we're cutting through that convex hull. So at this point, we were testing how well our model worked by trying to predict the corners just using the inside data. And it worked out really well, which gave us a good feeling that this model could extrapolate well. Okay, so that's a very simple 3-dimensional problem. We actually have all the corners of the cube. Life is good. Here's a very, very common machine learning data set. Many of you have probably seen it. It's the Wisconsin breast cancer data set. There's about 30 predictors. And I've got several different graphics here showing the correlation among many of these predictors. And so they did things like look at the tumor and say, let's look at the radius, the perimeter, and the area. Well, if you know geometry, they're all kind of related. And we not only looked at the mean, but we looked at the max. So, you know, I've got a 3D scatter plot there sort of showing a thin ribbon of points from the lower front left diagonal to the upper rear right diagonal. That's where the data is. The rest of that cubic volume is extrapolation. And that's just 3 of the 30 dimensions. So this is my way of trying to say, back to this, I don't think we fully appreciate, particularly we go to large dimensionalities, how much of a problem extrapolation can be. Okay, back to their slides. So here we're going to talk about the safe machine learning prediction and optimization via extrapolation control. So in the screen, you can see what we call a prediction profiler, where I've got a prediction for shrinkage versus 3 factors. This is a metallurgy process: compaction pressure, sintering temperature, and sintering time. And then I've got a 2D scatter plot of the compaction pressure versus the sintering temperature, and then a 3D scatter plot again with all the data. And the blue arrows are pointing to the red X and the red dot. That's where the current predictions are being made with this prediction profiler. And notice again, they're far away from the data. Okay, but we're still within the range of the factors. You know, we didn't go outside sort of the cube of the region, but we are in the realm of extrapolation. So one of the things that JMP does when you do make a prediction where you don't have data, the confidence intervals get very large, so they're pretty wide right here. But what you're going to see is we now have a facility to turn on this extrapolation control. And we can either turn on a warning or actually turn on the control. So we're going to start by showing with the warning on. And now what you're going to see is as I move the settings of a factor, we're looking at, this is diabetes data, we're looking at LTG here. I moved it all the way to the extreme, and you saw a little warning that said possible extrapolation. Okay, so this, and again, you'll see the confidence intervals getting large whenever we start to get into these extrapolation regions. Okay, I think I'll move on to the other thing we can do is actually turn extrapolation control on, and what you're going to see, notice the sort of the bow ties of confidence intervals around the straight line predictions here. Now notice how short the predictions are. What we're really doing now is we're not letting you see what the predictions are and the limits are where we don't have data. So we good?
Sorry. There's audio or video issue. I'm sorry. Oh, no, that's right. Oh, escape. We talked about this. Video. Okay, you can continue.
Say what, I'll look over here.
I'm gonna get
if you need to work there. So I feel like I may have missed the slide.
yes, you have to go back to the other.
This does not seem to be clicking.
You may have to tap back into the PowerPoint.
Good point. There you go. Okay. So this is with extrapolation control on, and there are 2 types of extrapolation that have been put into JMP. So the first one is this leverage extrapolation control. And this is whenever we're doing ordinary least squares, which is really on our fit model platform. And my point is there are people in the room who are not necessarily JMP users, may program in R or Python or something. You know, the statistical methods are going to be outlined later on. Those are the parts that I really can't speak to as well. But the point is you could do this yourself, but we're going to see how it's implemented here in JMP. So we use leverage extrapolation for the fit model with least squares. And then we have a more generalized version once we start doing things like penalized regression methods like lasso and elastic net and ridge and Danzig selectors. We also, if we publish models, we can take all those published models and actually look at multiples of them. It could be a neural net model versus a regression model versus a decision tree model, and put all 3 into the same profiler using this graph profiler method. And so these are the other platforms where this general extrapolation is already working: the neural, partial least squares, support vector machine, and naive Bayes. So on the least square extrapolation, this is based on leverage. There's a formula there for you. I always think of leverage as I got a bunch of data and there's one way over there. That's the one that if I took it out would change the model the most. Well, that's where the prediction variance is the largest. And so that's essentially what we're looking at. So this leverage is equivalent to this scaled prediction variance. On the general extrapolation control, they had some design goals. They wanted this to be fast to fit and score. It needed to work for continuous and categorical data. They wanted it to work out of the box. They wanted to use unsupervised models of the X's and be totally separate from the prediction model. And we wanted it to be robust to missing data, robust to linear dependencies, and relatively easy to explain. That's easy for them to say. So here's the idea behind generalized extrapolation. We typically start with we have data, we've got the X's, we've got the Y, we build some kind of supervised model. And from that, we can create a prediction profiler. And you've seen how you can easily interact with that profiler to come up with predictions. Then what we do is we create an unsupervised extrapolation control model. And that is used to help define when we're in extrapolation and when we're not. The details of that there's a lot hidden behind saying we just created this unsupervised extrapolation control. But they do have a paper full of simulations on it, so you're certainly welcome to peruse that. So let's go look at an example here. This is some fitness data that ships with jump. We're looking at the oxygen uptake for someone running on a treadmill, and we can measure things like their run time, their run pulse, their max pulse. And because we're going to use least squares, the metric is going to be leverage. And so here's a scatter plot matrix of those three factors. And the red dot is where we're optimizing. If we said, hey, show me the maximum oxygen uptake with extrapolation control on, and the blue is with the extrapolation control off. And I think you can see, I don't know if this laser's working, but the blue dot, particularly in the run pulse versus max pulse plot, is pretty far away from the correlation structure of the data. So once again, we can come into jump, turn on the warning, and I've got a bit of a video here to show again as I interact with the profiler. And I also have desirability turned on here, so that's where I can do optimization. So desirability is on a scale of 0 to 1, 0 being undesirable, 1 being desirable. But if I say maximize desirability, it looks in that three-dimensional space and says, here's the set of conditions that would give me the largest prediction for the oxygen uptake. And I've saved those settings down below. So I'm flipping back and forth between the midpoint settings and the optimum. Now what I'm going to do is turn on the controls, not just the warning. And now again, you can see we're at the edge. We've run ourselves into sort of a corner of the space, and we're lopping off profiler where we're going to be in an extrapolation mode. So if I turn the warning back on and now flip between the two different optimizations, you can see one optimization has the warning and the wider confidence intervals. The other one just truncates the profiler. So you can also adjust the extrapolation threshold. So we'll see this in the next example. The default when it's leverage is this K times the maximum leverage, and K has a value of 1. And again, maximum leverage to me is that's sort of the worst point we've got to start with. And then another adjustment you can make is you can choose to use this 3 times the average leverage. Again, 3 is the default setting, but if you want to be more conservative, you could make that multiplier lower. And what that's going to do is change the metric by which we decide how far are you from the data. So in this example, we'll turn on the threshold. So once again, we're kind of just going back and forth with our warning. It kicks on. But why is it kicking on? That's where if we turn on the threshold, okay, you can actually see the threshold is currently at 0.473. And so once that metric value, as I slide the different settings around here, gets greater than 0.473, that possible extrapolation message comes on. And again, this is the default using the maximum leverage. I could go back in and now change it from that maximum leverage to the average leverage, which is the model terms divided by the observation. The multiplier is 3. You can see that that note is now above the profiler, but the threshold went from 0.437 down to 0.387. So now I have a more conservative extrapolation control. And if we actually look at the optimization under this scheme, you'll see these desirability numbers over here. Get the laser again. You know, without any extrapolation control, it got almost to 1, almost to the best you could see. But it's not quite as good with the extrapolation control on, and with the more conservative, it's even poorer by a little bit. But this is where you have to look at your space and decide how far are you willing to tolerate being outside your data when you're making predictions with your model. Okay, maybe I should pause. Any comments, questions, and check the clock. Okay, so that was leverage extrapolation control. Now we're going to look at it with the generalized extrapolation. So this is going to be a neural model where, again, we're going to use the diabetes data that I showed earlier. Many of you have seen this data set. It's from 2004. It's Efron, Hasty, Tibshirani, Johnstone. Yep. So again, a very popular data set to look at comparing different machine learning methods. And now we're going to use something called the regularized t-square. And so now when we do it, we only have one option, which is the multiplier. We don't get to choose between 2 different methods. The default is 3, which is essentially 3 standard deviations of the sample regularized t-square. And so the regularized t-square, there will be more slides on that discussing the mathematics behind it, but think of it as a generalized version of that leverage idea, okay? And so again, I'm not going to run a video on this, but having done the optimization 2 ways and recorded those optimizations down below here, you can see again, one with the extrapolation control off, one with it on. I've circled total cholesterol and LDL, so you can see the settings are about a factor of 2 different from each other when you have those 2 different optima, even though the desirabilities are somewhat similar this time. So when we go and look at a 2D scatter plot of all of the potential predictors, I've circled in red the square where we're looking at LDL versus total cholesterol, and you'll see the one optimum, the red dot, is right in the middle of the scatter of the data, whereas the blue dot is off in a corner, which is clearly far away from where the data has been taken. So again, trying to make sure we know when is that model going to be valid and when won't it. So one more example here is where we can save lots of different models in JMP, and you save the formula to a column. Then what we can do is we can stack up those formula in a single profiler and do an optimization across multiple responses. So in this case, we have some metallurgy data where we'll look at the shrinkage with a least squares model, but we'll look at the surface condition, which is a binary response, pass or fail, with a nominal logistic model. And then we'll also do this optimization. So again, in this case, we have the top profiler is the shrinkage. So that's a continuous response. The next one, this is the probability. You can see there's actually a curve here, but you'll notice many of these traces are either very, very short or almost a point, because the optimum has taken us to that little corner of the data set. And once again, I'll point out down below here, among the settings, when I compare the optimization with and without extrapolation control, there's almost a factor of 2 difference in this one factor called ratio. So again, when we look at the scatter plot matrix of the 2 different optima and where they fall, you can see the red one is much closer to the data. It looks to me just slightly outside the cloud, whereas last time it fell right in it. But the blue dot, again, in ratio here versus the compaction pressure in that particular cell is pretty far from the data. And all of this is without going outside the ranges of the factors. And a lot of times you give someone a model, you know, if you don't lock it down and tell them this is the range over which that's what we often do now. We say this is the range. But the point is, in high dimensions, even the range may not be enough to prevent erroneous predictions by extrapolation here. So this is where the third speaker, who really did the sort of research behind this, began the talk. And the slides actually have his voiceover. So if you download the slide deck, you can actually hear his words to what's going on here. So mine will be closer to reading it. He tends to explain what all these bullets mean, but the whole idea here again is we wanted something fast to fit and score. So the interactivity of these traces and the optimization. We want to support lots of different data types. We want to be robust to missing cells and robust to linear dependencies. So I gave you a really good example of that with that breast cancer data with the radius, perimeter, and area. being highly correlated, easy to automate. And so I guess this is just a repeat on the leverage. You just see it. And so he gives several interpretations. I like the one about it being the scaled prediction variance. Pretty intuitive for defining extrapolation. And so the maximum leverage points beyond or outside the convex hull of the training data. Okay, and I really, partly because that convex hull was something I could see years ago, I like that idea of knowing where's the boundary of the design. And so there are the two choices, either maximum leverage or some multiplier of the average leverage. Okay. And I think they added a new genetic algorithm to the optimization in JMP because of the optimization with extrapolation control. Okay, once again, the magic happens with the unsupervised extrapolation control. That's how we were able to define these traces where we know we're inside versus outside the design space. Okay. The generalized predictive modeling is where we can now be using Hotelling's t-squared. And so there's some analogy to leverage here, but that leverage can be interpreted as a measure of multivariate distance from the mean of the data, and that this suggests Hotelling's t-squared is a distance metric for predictive models in general, and some distributional assumptions determine an upper control limit. And I know the voiceover here that Jeremy talks about why it's not a one-to-one to leverage, but it is, this Hotelling's t-squared is very similar in idea. So math for those of you that wanted it. Okay, I'll just say there's more coming. And there's a lot of talk about how, let me see, again, you can go to their archive paper to see the simulation details, but a lot of this is based on work. It says Schaefer and Strimmer. They did a lot of work with genetic data where you had I think, lots of data and very wide data sets. And so things were sort of unstable, and they came up with some ideas for these shrinkage estimators. And so that lambda there, where it says there's an analytical expression, this is based on that work by Schaefer and Strimmer, and is what they use to make this a more robust method. So once again, I put the link to the paper there, and it's been submitted to the Journal of Computational and Graphical Statistics. All right, more additional details. This is a very long way to me of saying, when you have missing data, we don't just knock out the whole row. We actually go in and try to say, okay, just this is missing, but these things are still here. Let's hang on to that data and not throw away that information. Okay. And some of the advantages of this method, I'll just try to get them all out here. It balances that bias variance trade-off, which we're always trying to do, shown to work well in high dimensions. It's closely related to principal components analysis and partial least squared models with a t-squared and a d mod x constraint. Don't ask me about t-squared, let alone d mod x. But there's discussion of that by the authors. And it's generalized as well to other types of models, robust to nonlinear relationships, and one metric simplifies usage and interpretation. So in summary, better visualization of feasible regions for high dimensional models in the profiler. This genetic algorithm that's been added now works for flexible constrained optimization. It handles messy observational data, and it's available in many of the predictive modeling platforms. And if it's not in one that you see, let us know. It'll probably make it into more as we advance these ideas. It's importantly available in the graph profiler, so you can take lots of disparate models, a tree model, a neural model, a regression model, put them all together and do some trade space analysis and optimization subject to that extrapolation control. And future directions are to add k-nearest neighbor-based metrics. So when you've got clusters of data, we know when you're within the clusters and when you're not. So that's coming in the future. So that's my take on their presentation they were going to give here. I hope I've given you the links to if you want to learn more. But any questions you want to? Oh gosh, there's a bunch. I always start with Jim here because he always asks the hardest one.
My buddy. Yeah, the paper you referenced, the 2004 paper by Tiver is a paper that basically introduces least angle regression as a technique for estimating the parameters.
Yep.
And it looks like you're using least squares in this, is that true?
Well, in that example, we did least squares. I mean, we use that data set. When you open it up in JMP,
Yeah.
we have 10 different methods that we use. We use it as, let's compare different methods.
Okay, have you done the same analysis using the least angle regression approach? Because the point of our paper is that X prime X inverse you're using for the leverage is sometimes ill conditioned, if there is in this case. You get more bad estimates of both the parameters and the uncertainties.
I don't know what we have that's closest to least angles regression, but
Well, when he used the diabetes data,
Yeah.
he was doing a neural model, so it was using the Hoteling's T-square, it wasn't using the leverage.
Okay.
So,
But if he estimated, I see.
but actually early on, Chris's part of the talk used regression.
did he have-
So like, the diabetes first time around was regression, second time around was neural.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay, thanks. We have a Luke over here.
Yeah, my question, I think you probably said this, but it just went over my head. But I get that this is extrapolation control for prediction, but is it also happening in training where it's actually going to change some of the prediction values, like as you train the model? Or is it just letting you know when you're outside your bounds on prediction?
Well, it's not changing anything in the training. So, and maybe that's actually, you brought up a point I didn't make. When I did the neural model, the extrapolation control is built only on the training data. So we're not using any of the validation or test data that we've set aside. So when we say it's extrapolating, it's only on what we fit.
Gotcha.
Any other questions? All right.